For Westlock St. Paul.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank the honourable member from Disnethe, Mississippi, Churchill River, for the opportunity to have a discussion and participate in this debate today. I'd also like to congratulate him for not only having the vision but the courage to put this bill forward. I have had the opportunity to move a private member's bill through this hallowed place, and it's not something that is easy to do, especially when you're not talking about National Tree Day or something that everybody agrees with. You're talking about something that is somewhat contentious. It actually takes the courage and strength of character to be able to even put the motion forward. And at the end of the day, Mr. Speaker, I sit back and I wonder, well, what is it that gives him this strength? And you have to look at his history. You have to look at his past. You have to look at the fact that this is a member of Parliament who grew up on a First Nations reserve. This is a member of Parliament who raised his children in a First Nations community, who has lived under this Act and understands what this Act does to individuals. I have First Nations communities in my riding. I've taken the opportunity not only to talk to some of the leadership of those communities, but to average people on the ball diamond, people that you're sitting there talking to that are affected by this day in and day out and don't get some of the benefits that the leadership gets when they deal with this Act. And I have to tell you, this is troubling. There is nobody, whether they be on the other side today or on this side, that hasn't called this Act a paternalistic piece of legislation that is a failed opportunity for us to move forward. This is a failed piece of legislation. Nobody disagrees with that. Canadians as a whole don't disagree with that. We as Canadians are sitting on the precipice waiting for a direction to go, and that is what leaders are voted into this place to do, to help guide us in that direction. I believe there is a role for private members in this place. I believe that the private members who have lived their life under a piece of legislation that we all agree has failed should have the ability to stand up in this place and say we need to go forward in a different direction. And we should have these discussions in the House of Commons, in the Canadian Parliament, and we shouldn't be on any side of this House attacking people for simply putting forward the discussion.
That's right.
I would direct members to the actual summary of the piece of legislation we're talking about, and I quote, "The enactment amends the Indian Act to require band councils to publish their bylaws and repeal certain outdated provisions of the Act. It also requires the Minister of Indian and Northern Affairs to report annually to the House of Commons Committee responsible for Aboriginal affairs on the work undertaken by his or her department in collaboration with First Nations organizations." In collaboration with First Nations organizations and other interested parties each and every year, Mr. Speaker. If that's not starting dialogue, I don't know what is. That is what this legislation is about. We all agree that this is a paternalistic piece of legislation that is a failure, that is rooted in 200-year-old language. Now what this member from Disnethe, Mississippi, Churchill River is saying is that we need to start having the conversation about how we're going to take this to the next level. You know, I would like to remind members of the history of our government. Well, yeah, it's true. We didn't come into this place 6.5 years ago with a national strategy to deal with it. We came with a plan that included amending the Canadian Human Rights Act to make sure First Nations communities are represented under the Canadian Human Rights Act. I sat on the Aboriginal Affairs Committee when that came forward and listened to the NDP fight for 2 years the ability to bring First Nations communities under the Human Rights Act. They'd much rather run to the United Nations and look for condemnation of Canadians as a whole than sit down, roll up their sleeves, and work with this side to make positive changes. Who here doesn't think, including every person in Canada under the Human Rights Act, isn't a positive change? Family homes on reserves and Matrimonial Property Act. Sounds like a positive to me, Mr. Speaker. First Nations Financial Transparency Act. I'm not sure what they have against transparency, but I think when I sit down and talk to members, I know when I talk to community members of First Nations communities, as I'm going to do tomorrow in my riding, they demand transparency of their leadership, just as they demand transparency of the Prime Minister, his cabinet, and every member of Parliament.
Sure do.
Safe Drinking Water for First Nations Act. These are just examples of things that our government did. We didn't come in with a national strategy. We came in with a plan to actually make a difference for people's lives on reserve. And I think that's much more important than taking another 5 years to develop another strategy that nobody ever actually looks at implementing. Now, Mr. Speaker, I sit there and I wonder why would they not be in favor of things like bringing First Nations communities into on-reserve communities? Why wouldn't you be in favor of bringing human rights to these communities? Well, you're right. It has to be politics. It has to be because they like the system, because they benefit from the system. That is, in fact, the case. They would rather stick First Nations communities in neutral and never see actual action taken. They'd rather have another white paper, bring up discuss racist comments from 30 years ago, rather than actually look forward into the future, as my honorable colleague from Disney, Mississippi, Churchill River, that's a long riding, would have us do, and start having the discussion, start having the debate. That is how we make changes in this great country. It is through rigorous debate. It's okay to bring your positions forward, have First Nations communities bring their positions forward, and have this reported back to Parliament every year. I couldn't think of a more democratic, collaborative approach than what the member is actually proposing. And I congratulate him for that. Mr. Speaker, I see I don't have much time left. I would like to make one other comment. I would like to make a plea, actually. I'd like the NDP, the new Democratic Party of Canada, to actually stand up for once and throw off the shackles of their whip. On this side of the House, we have proven that we have the courage to stand up for our constituents and vote their conscience. I would ask the NDP to do the same. We're talking about having a conversation with First Nations communities, with Canadians, with political parties, reporting it back to Parliament. You'll still get a chance to have your input. But vote your conscience for a change. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The time provided for the consideration of private members' business is now expired, and the order is dropped to the bottom of the order of precedence on the order paper. The honourable member for Westlock St. Paul will have 3 minutes when this matter returns before the House.